it's just useful to have a record.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Let's kick off. So this year, as I'm sure you're aware, we've been seeing more and more, well, quite a few hurricanes, floods, and other horrors that are heralding this new and much darker age that the world is moving into. We've also seen a couple of big developments in climate politics. So particularly those associated with institutions from the United Nations family of organizations. One of those is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it produced a report. The reports are drawn up by climate scientists and they come out every 7 or 8 years. Tazy, what's your take on the report? What's different or striking about the report this year?
So yeah, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit at this point now about generally what is going on with what we know to be the case about the climate crisis. So this report has a lot more emphasis on the prospect of extreme weather events, which is obviously something that, as Gareth was just saying, we are now like seeing very clearly happening, like the wildfires in Greece and Turkey and across the United States, and the devastation that caused. Flooding, we see flooding regularly now, even in the UK. In the north, we see a lot of that, like that's happening a lot more. But what this report is showing us is that we should expect that is going to continue in frequency and extremity. And the other thing is that we've got a greater awareness now of non-linear climate processes. So the fact that as the amount of carbon dioxide in the air goes up, we're not just going to see and the temperature goes up. It's not going to be it's not going to be a steady process. There's going to be points where certain events will unlock other more extreme events. And so we'll have tipping points that will essentially cause somewhat irreversible damage. So that's kind of what we're learning now from the new reports. And I'm just going to touch on a few kind of different areas where environmental devastation is kind of most urgent. So yeah, we already mentioned events like wildfires and flooding. Urban heat is another one. Like the proportion of people who are now exposed to really high levels of heat for a substantial amount of time is going up and up, and is potentially deadly in many places. Ocean acidification is on the rise. We're living through an extinction event of animal species that is kind of impossible to imagine, of sort of 40 species a day going extinct. We're seeing like a very high pace of deforestation for clearing land for agriculture and animal agriculture. And of course, we're also seeing ever increasing fossil fuels emissions, even though there was a brief slowdown for COVID, it still has continued to rise year on year. Or I think possibly with the exception of 1 year, but I'm not sure. And obviously, we are surrounded by like headlines about the worsening climate crisis all the time. We try to usually block it out of our what we're thinking about. But I think that we do have to have moments where we inform ourselves about these things, and none of it is all or nothing. It's not that there's kind of a single catastrophe that is about to engulf us all. It's things getting progressively worse, and we have to understand that as informing the sort of new terrain that we are organizing on and resisting on, and understanding what the likely trajectories that we are on look like and how we can stop them. And the more clearly we can understand that, the better. I'll hand back over to Gareth now to explain more about the COP talks.
Right, yeah, thanks. So the IPCC report, which is detailing some of the processes that Tazy's been highlighting, it's one of the major climate political events this year. The other big climate institution is known as the COP. It stands for Conference of Parties, which is jargon for some kind of big meeting held in the international legal sphere, essentially. And there are some scientists there as well, but the COP is mainly for politicians, for diplomats. And the COP meetings, they began in the mid-1990s. They've been, yearly events ever since. Some years have bigger COPs, more important COPs than others, and this year is a pretty big one. It's going to be in Glasgow. I'm sure you all are aware. It's starting a few weeks from now. It's going to be hosted by a prime minister who lives just a few minutes from SOAS. So we're all in a better position to exert pressure on the events than we're going to be at future COPs. And there's a lot of hope swirling around the Glasgow COP, but I fear it's a mirage. In terms of climate politics, we're living in a moment of false hope, a false dawn. The war against the climate denialists is a war that we have won. But this what is essentially the same war is having to be fought all over again against the climate delayers and other fantasists. And the new form of fantasy is every bit as irrational as climate denialism, even though this new form is a language spoken by the liberals, not by the Donald Trumps and co. I'm going to give you an example of a core element in this new climate delayism. If I can just screen share. Is that allowed? Yes, I'm screen sharing, good. So this is a quote from John Kerry, who is Joe Biden's climate ambassador or climate envoy, where he said a couple of months ago that America is leading the way, of course, on climate change, etc. And then he said half of the emissions reductions that are going to help decarbonize the world are going to come from technologies we don't yet have. And this seems to me to sum up sort of techno-optimism or technology fetishism, as I would call it, that dominates thinking today. The idea that there's a technological magic bullets or a whole host of them, an array of them, that we can ask our boffins and engineers to just think up, crack on with it, implement them, and business as usual can just carry on, profits can be made, businesses can expand, we can all live exactly the same lifestyles. Nothing need really change except there are going to be magical new technologies. And this is really the dominant strand of thinking within bourgeois politics on the question of climate, I would say. So this is, so technology dominates thinking in each COP that we see, and this one will be no different, I fear. And if one single graph can sum up our climate plight, it is this one, and two different versions I've given you here, where we plot the line of carbon dioxide emissions as measured at Mauna Loa, and against that we plot the meetings of the COP. What you see is the diplomats and lawmakers meet every year, COP after COP after COP, and do absolutely nothing to reduce the carbon, the relentless rise of carbon emissions. So how do we in RS21 and how do other Marxists situate this problem, which is increasingly an existential one for, ultimately for the human species, I fear? Tazy, I think, can speak a bit on that question.
Cool. So I think if I understood right from everyone's introductions that everybody here at Civil Buzz is RS21 already. So I'm just going to frame this bit in terms of the pamphlet that we're about to publish called Anti-Capitalism Against the Climate Crisis. No, it's called We Only Want the Earth, and then it's Anti-Capitalism Against the Climate Crisis. And one thing that it does really, really well is explain a concept called the metabolic rift, which is something that people have probably heard, but I'm going to try to give an explanation of it as best I can. So the idea of the metabolic rift is essentially an idea about, well, why is it that Marxists say that capitalism can't solve the climate crisis? Why is it that we say that capitalism is like, that it's not just a question of some small fixes that would reconcile ecological sustainability with capitalism? And the metabolic rift, I think, is a really useful framework for understanding that. So essentially the idea, and I'm going to quote from the pamphlet even, is that under capitalism, the metabolic exchange, the use by society of resources and the return to the environment becomes one-sided. More is taken than is returned or allowed to replenish. So because capitalist accumulation requires constant expansion, profit-driven competition, it will always be seeking to have new frontiers of commodification, exploitation that will then inevitably cause problems with kind of the use of natural resources. And climate change and emissions is kind of one manifestation of that, but we can point to many others, like for instance, the overuse of soil or of overfishing or whatever it might be. It's about like that kind of a process that is expanding much more than nature can allow to sustain, and so therefore it has to keep on looking for new ways to displace that. And I might even do a
screen share.
I might do a screen share. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to do that actually. 2 seconds.
Go for it.
Okay, and I'm going to zoom in a bit. Oops, no, I did not mean to go incognito. Okay, this is like a small table that is again screenshotted from the pamphlet that is explaining kind of the metabolic rift from different different sort of manifestations of it. So the metabolic rift as the central one is about this flow of resources with the social metabolism embedded in wider metabolisms of sort of nature. And that this opens spatial rifts where, and that is kind of characteristic of colonialism, where capitalism looks for, having exhausted certain spaces, looks for new spaces, and so physically, geographically expands. And temporal rifts, where the pace of production, of accumulation, of uses of resources is outpacing what can be reproduced. And then as the kind of mirror, this framework also identifies then shifts, which is kind of how that then gets displaced. So Gareth was also already mentioning about technologies. So it's kind of like, always looking for another technology that can try to, for a while, offset that rift that is opening up. Spatial shifts, moving to new processes and locations. And temporal shift, sort of trying to kind of edit, undo, but never quite enough, and usually not in a way that actually replenishes what has been destroyed, but in a way that kind of does so just in order to be able to return to that process again and again and again. So I'm sure that was not a very technical explanation of the metabolic rift, but this comes from Kohei Saito, who you can read if you want to know more about that. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to throw into the conversation at this point, is like a useful framework for putting forward that argument about capitalism and ecology. The author of the pamphlet is Harry from RS21, but the person who's kind of quoting from there is Kohei Saito, who wrote a huge big book about Marx's ecology, I believe. Okay, back to Gareth.
Sure. So when we're talking about capitalism here, just to get back to basics, we're not talking about simply the market or private property. We're speaking about capitalism as a total system, as a global machinery of power, the goal of which is to accumulate capital, and the method of which is to squeeze resources from the planet faster and faster, with not a shred of concern for the ecological viability, for future consequences, and then to get the workers of the world at the lowest pay that bosses can get away with, to fabricate those resources into commodities, and then for consumers to spend as much as possible on those commodities when they get onto the supermarket shelves. And some of these some of these processes are regulated by states. I mean, the role of states is to one of the roles of states is to maintain stable conditions for capital accumulation. But states themselves are pillars of this system. They're sustaining capitalism, they're reproducing it, they're acting as agents of capital, they're grabbing resources for their businesses, subsidizing them, and so forth. And all of this analysis, it applies, we think, just as much to communist China or to the Soviet Union when it was around back then, states that we see as state capitalist formations. So capitalism then in this analysis is much more than just an economic system. It would only be a little too crude to say that states have been captured or are captured by the capitalist class, by the people and the firms and the hedge funds who own pretty much all of the world's land and equipment and who hire most of the workers in the world. And keeping those workers in a state of subjection, in a subaltern condition, that goal is being continually fought ever and anew by the firms, by the states, through creating forms of oppression and recreating them, oppression of the poorer nations, of Black and brown people, of women, and so on and so forth. Now, if we look at the system in the way that I've just been doing, it can seem totalitarian, it can seem omnipotent, a juggernaut that's simply going to drive the world to doom, and maybe it will. But it's also a system that relies completely on people that can never fully control, the working people, especially, who make the goods, without which all the economies would shrink to nothing and the profits would nosedive, as we saw a hint of that in the lockdowns last year. And it's also a system that is perpetually causing crises, straightforward economic crises, but also on a bigger, more sinister scale, the environmental destruction in the form of the floods and the fires that we were talking about earlier, the blowback from its resource expansion and careless neglect of the world. And also there are rivalries between states, conflicts, and so on. And above all, there's the resistance from those who make the goods of the world and provide the services, and those who suffer from capitalist exploitation and oppression. So here we're moving to the question of class struggle, which is in the broad, which we understand in the broadest sense of the term, which is ongoing, and the way and where we have to look for hope, I think. And Tazy, can you speak on that?
Sorry, just going back to the notes. So yeah, at this point, I was going to talk a bit about like ideas about class struggle and climate. And okay, yeah, no, this is an aside actually, but sort of talking in the same way that we're talking about kind of interconnected crises and class struggle, trying to bring in a bit of an idea about like the pandemic, and that also as a manifestation of a particular, sorry, I should have said this bit earlier at the metabolic rift bit, but about like, obviously COVID was a zoonotic disease, we can expect more zoonotic diseases, and like linking that into how we think about climate devastation. Like it is pretty clear now that the worse the climate crisis gets, the more likely we are to have further pandemics. And so I think that that's something that needs to be informing a kind of class-based anti-capitalist climate politics as well. Another dimension of the climate crisis that I think has to be brought into focus is around like migration and borders. And do you know what? Sorry, I didn't make enough notes for this bit. Gareth, do you want to go back to talking about the next bit? Yeah, sorry, I didn't prepare enough here. Sorry.
No. You just summed up one of the key points, which I had neglected to mention, which was the relationship between climate and the pandemic. The pandemic is another example of blowback. But when we're looking onto the question of how to resist this madness, the goal, above all, obviously has to be building mass movements, and within those movements, creating hubs of revolutionaries who can turn thinking beyond the immediate goals of the campaign and movement. I mean, obviously fighting for those goals, but beyond that, looking to create a new system, a socialist system, a society that's geared to human need, a society that can enable resources and labor to be distributed through democratic planning, and above all, a society that is puts everything into keeping the planet habitable. And to create those mass movements, it's going to be crucial, or it is obviously crucial, to build links between environmentalist and workers' struggles, the green and the red. And this is much more possible than some would think, I would suggest. Workers have always struggled over the workplace environment, on questions of safety, pollution, toxins, and so on. It's working people who suffer the most from these ills. And so workplace issues and workers' issues are absolutely continuous with green issues. And for most trade unionists, nowadays, today, in the last few years, and for much of the left, the program to address the climate crisis goes by the name of the Green New Deal. And trade unions are at the center of this program, I think. But it's a program that attracts support from a huge spectrum of opinion. At the very right-wing end, there are those who see it simply as a Green New Deal is just a state-sponsored way of kickstarting economic growth and diverting big subsidies from taxpayers to infrastructure projects. There was an example of this in South Korea earlier in this century, which was the Green Growth Plan, so-called, of President Lee Myung-bak, a conservative president. And there was absolutely nothing green about it at all. It just involved pouring megatons of concrete, building lots of nuclear power stations, that sort of thing. At the other end of the spectrum, we have far left support for the Green New Deal. On the far left, we see it as an opportunity to wrest reforms from capitalist states, building movements until the ensuing contradictions can crack open and reveal spaces beyond this capitalist order. But if we're going to create conditions for a radical Green New Deal, that has to mean working in the unions, but also out on the streets. You probably remember a few years ago, the Labour Party passed a Green New Deal motion in the Corbyn era. It was a wonderfully radical motion. It set a 2030 target for net zero. It committed the Labour Party to welcome climate refugees, to nationalize the fossil fuel industries, and to pay for decarbonization initiatives by soaking the rich. That motion would never have got to the conference floor if it hadn't been from movements outside that conference, outside that party. Movements, above all, the school strikes, Fridays for the Future, and Extinction Rebellion, and so on. But then that same Green New Deal motion for the Labour Party, before it reached the conference, it included a call to end airport expansion. That's not a very radical demand. Not only must we end airport expansion, all airports except Heathrow and Glasgow have to be shut down in Britain by 2030. And all airports, full stop, really have to be shut by 2050 if net zero is going to be reached. And instead, that motion was simply to curtail expansion. Even that was nixed by a couple of the union leaderships, the GMB and Unite, before the motion could get to the conference floor, so it didn't come. And this brings me to the question of degrowth, because alongside the Green New Deal, one of the other programmatic initiatives that we come across a lot these days is degrowth. A movement, it's a very disparate movement. It covers a wide spectrum of opinion. Broadly speaking, it's calling for a very rapid reduction of energy throughput, of resource throughput. There's also a very strong far left involved in the degrowth movement. They see a kind of class struggle degrowth approach, stripping the rich of their fortunes, but enabling the billions of poor people in the world to eat better food, live in good housing, abundant clean water, essentially a socialist program. A program that says for people in the global north, there would have to be reduced consumption of certain commodities, beef, most obviously, SUVs, aviation. But on the other hand, we could have better public transport, insulated homes, cleaner air, and in lots of important intangibles, more self-governed time, less hierarchy, and so on. This sort of degrowth element, I think, can be built within union circles and within student groups. I would definitely expect. I mean, just in my own union branch, I'm in the UCU. I put a motion last week looking ahead to COP, and it called for, it pointed out, I mean, one of its elements was, I pointed out that academia, my industry, academia encourages us, incentivizes us to do a lot of aviation traveling, to fly around the world to conferences and so on. And the motion is calling for the UCU to campaign for academia to reverse that process, to incentivize us to travel by train if need be, but not by plane. And that was very keenly supported, but it does raise the tricky question for every trade unionist of jobs. What do we say to sectors in the economy that have to be shut down, like aviation? And this is why I think programs for climate jobs are incredibly important. There's a danger in the green jobs program, like every other environmental program, getting assimilated to mainstream bourgeois opinion. An example of this for green jobs was, maybe you saw, I don't know if anyone saw Keir Starmer. He was interviewed on London Tonight, I think about a week ago, and he was asked a question about climate politics, and immediately his face took on this weird look, a look that's simultaneously scared and robotic, which is odd because robots can't know fear, but this is how he looked, and he had this knee-jerk reaction and just said, climate change just makes me think of jobs, job opportunities. And so in the hands of someone like Starmer, climate jobs talk can become a way of marginalizing radicalism and just saying environmentalism cannot mean anything if it doesn't mean economic growth. Nonetheless, I do think that we should be rebuilding green climate jobs movements. It's absolutely essential to find ways of reaching out to workers on a politics of a just transition, and that first and foremost means recognizing the real fears of job insecurity that workers in sectors like aviation naturally have. So there's some of the programmatic strategies that are in discussion on the left, but there's also others that maybe you could talk about, Tazy.
Yes, so now I'm going to talk about kind of the other big debate on the sort of left of the climate movement, which is about direct action strategies and tactics. So obviously in the UK, the biggest, well, yeah, like the most visible and active climate activist network is Extinction Rebellion. And their original strategy was very much like, we're going to take over the streets, we're going to overwhelm the police will then be persuaded by our politics, they will then pressure the government to adopt good climate policies, and we can do that once we get exactly 3% of the population on protests. And it was this like very formulaic idea about like, you get enough people protesting, and at that point then you overwhelm the police, and so their idea of what direct action was about kind of just making yourself very inconvenient. And so they target things that are just like, you know, the center of London or whatever, and they aimed to get arrested. I think they've broadly moved away from that. You don't really hear so much of that kind of talk about like, we need to get X number of people arrested, or I think that they've learned a lot from their experiences, and I think they've kind of realized that they're not going to suddenly convince the police. The only thing that they did convince the police of was that they needed more powers to repress protests. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm blaming XR for that. Like, I think if they had been targeting anything else, then we would have also probably seen the police bill. The police bill was obviously also targeting Black Lives Matter. So but basically, that does throw up the kind of main difficulty for direct action, which is that you're going to be met with police repression whenever you do these things. So further framing this debate is Andreas Malm, the climate thinker and activist and writer, who has recently published a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. His argument is that the climate movement should accept, as part of the repertoire of its tactics, sabotage of fossil fuel infrastructure. And so I think that's something that is something that we have seen happen. Like, for instance, the resistance to the Wet'suwet'en's resistance to the pipeline in Canada, and with Ende Gelände, they've also been doing occupations to prevent these things being built. There are multiple possible targets in the UK, like the North Sea oil, the coal mine that might open in Cumbria, and a fracking site in, I can't remember where, but all of these have then seen roadblocks, occupations, activists trying to take quite direct action to disrupt that. So I think that's something that kind of trying to learn about what makes for good direct action, and kind of trying to, so I mean, I think that good direct action looks like a good target that makes the point well. It doesn't just make the point, it also does actually interrupt a construction process, a supply chain, whatever it might be. It does actually directly, that's the direct and indirect action is actually making that difference. And that it opens up possibilities for solidarity. So for instance, can the local community come down and join that picket? Are you speaking to the workers in the plant? Could they potentially be got to come on side? And so kind of having a bit more of an organizing mentality rather than a kind of visibility mentality to direct action, I think is quite important for making the case to people of why direct action and sabotage could be important tactics, and kind of trying to break down the kind of commitment to the kind of quite hippie-ish non-violence commitment that you can encounter sometimes, breaking down what does someone actually mean by violence. Why on earth should we think that property damage is violent? That doesn't that's not something we should accept, and so on. And I think, yeah, it's a strategic question that I think really helps to open up questions about who should we be targeting, and how can we build power to stop fossil fuel developments. I think we can also look at other non-climate examples of successful direct action that's been going on, like Palestine Action, and they're absolutely relentless shutting down of Elbit, the Stansted 15 case a couple of years back, and the kind of growing eviction resistance movement. So many more people getting skilled up in doing short notice eviction resistances, which directly prevent evictions, demonstrate who's got the power, who's going to try to break apart your picket, and provide very visible rallying points for communities. I think these are kinds of examples we can kind of try to learn from as good direct action lessons. Yes, thank you. That's it from me.
Thank
Great.
you both.
That's us done, really.
That was fantastic. We really enjoyed the back and forth format as well. I said that I would, thank you both very much. That was, I think, a really useful, I found I've read the draft of the climate pamphlet that we're going to be publishing, and even with that fresh in my mind, I still feel like this talk that the two of you just gave was still helping me kind of add to and refine some of those ideas. So thank you. I said that before we started the discussion, I would briefly list some key activities and actions that are happening around London in the next month, basically. So just to do that quickly, the first most obvious one is the COP26 Day of Action March in London, which is on November 6th. That is, there's going to be demonstrations simultaneously in most major cities, I think, in Britain. and obviously in Glasgow and London will be the biggest ones. So it's starting at 12 noon outside the Bank of England and then marching to Trafalgar Square. And I think mobilizing for that is something we can talk about maybe in the rest of our session this evening. Then there's also after that this thing called the People's Summit, which is kind of like, I mean, it feels like a kind of COP themed answer to The World Transformed with a similar range of kind of revolutionary to reformist politics on offer. It's kind of a festival. There's going to be in-person stuff and also a lot of online stuff. And that's happening from the 7th to the 10th of November. It seems like there's a really like a lot of different sessions. So I think definitely we should check those out and engage with them as we see fit. Then there's the RS21 climate pamphlet, which we are publishing in the run up to the COP, and we're going to have a launch party in London for it in the first week of November. And we need to book a venue and choose a date for that, and talk about how we can use that as an opportunity to push out the pamphlet and the politics within it. And there's also in a kind of more long-running thing, I suppose, these COP26 hubs. There's local ones in Hackney and Waltham Forest. There's also a London-wide one. So if anyone wants to get involved in direct organizing around COP26, those are the places to go to. So yeah, that's just a brief summary, and now we can move to open discussion. And I think it's definitely like my wish that we use the time to kind of discuss ways that we can organize in the next month and also beyond the COP as well, because it's going to be a small impact if we just do the organizing in the next month and then drop climate after that, because there's no COP. So I think that would be a good thing to use a conversation for. I don't think that any of the people we met at university stalls who signed up and registered for the Zoom have actually made it into the meeting, which is a real shame. But we've got the recording, so if any of them want it, we can send that to them pending people's consent. And yeah, it's true. I mean, Freshers Week is a crazy time. But also, like, thanks to some of them registering, we now have emails for a few more of them who weren't actually on the sign-up sheet. So that's good. We can invite them to the climate pamphlet launch, which will be not during Freshers Week. So yeah, just raise your hand, your real hand or your virtual hand, and we can do a go around and discuss what to do. Roderick.
I actually want to make some bit of a point, actually, really, based on what I just heard, because there are a couple of things I wanted to say in response to that. I guess wonder, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess on the question about the fantasies that Gareth is talking about, I don't know, I take a view that's actually much more cynical than Gareth actually on this, in the sense that I don't believe that many of the climate change deniers actually believe what they were saying. And likewise, I don't actually believe that many of the people advocating techno fantasies actually believe what they're saying either. I mean, if you look at all the stuff that comes out of people like Kerry and Biden, they're still pumping massive sums into the oil industry. It often feels like, and this is going to sound very conspiratorial, but listen, I'm leading this way now, that this is all literally greenwash, and the real plan is basically protect the assets of the top 2%, everyone else can go to hell. We're not doing anything to solve this at all. And that's the end of it. I mean, I think somebody on Twitter, I forget who it was, said, you know, the plan is passive genocide. And, you know, I kind of feel that that might be actually true amongst many, that actually they think this can't be solved. So it's a matter of protecting our clients, the rich few, the 1%. Everyone else just has to survive as best as can, as best they can, and that's it. And of course, in that situation, of course, whipping up racism against massive migrant flows that will inevitably result will be a very important part of what they try and do to keep people in line. in the global north anyway. So, I mean, yeah, that's one thing that we need to think about in serious terms, in more long term. And how do we organize to defend the rights of migrants who will be coming up here, going north in very large numbers, I suspect, in the years to come, in response to what is being done overwhelmingly by the government states and countries of the global north. Just in terms of organizing, it's worth briefly talking about locally. Waltham Forest, there's now a coalition set up, Waltham Forest COP26, which has at its heart the local trades council, which is quite promising in terms of what the guys are saying about the links between the trade union movement and the workers' movement and the environmental movement. It is, a lot of it is old left people, I guess, like the SWP and so forth. But that's fine as far as it goes. It's a start. A bunch of them went down, including myself, went down to a rather successful protest on a related issue, local issue, the Edmonton incinerator. Around 200 to 300 people turned up for that and blocked the the North Circle, I think also was blocked for the best part of an hour or two. So that was a very successful protest, a successful piece of direct action. Interesting to see, the Extinction Rebellion was there, and they had a rather good strategy, which I wish more organizations would take up, of actually having trained people going around and speaking to all the people in the cars to explain what's going on and why, and having a dialogue with them, which is a very good idea. And a few actually drivers came out and actually sat and watched and sort of joined in a sort of observational, but not particularly hostile sort of way. So it did get somewhere. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is in terms of what happens afterwards, because I'm of the view that direct action has limited effect. It does have a role to play, but I think it's going to be fairly limited because it's fairly easy to not just suppress but also demonize small groups of direct action activists, just causing havoc with everyone else. And we've seen this actually with some of the recent protests. Mass strikes are obviously going to be much more effective, but much more difficult to get over climate issues. One possible which is being talked about in Waltham Forest again, is the idea of a council tax strike, where people actually withhold council tax to force local governments to accede to whatever demands are appropriate to whatever area. There is one actually up and running now around the Edmonton incinerator. I don't know how big it is. It's very symbolic. It's like withdrawing £10 of each of your every monthly bill. In itself, I suspect, isn't that effective. But I am a veteran, as it were, of the campaign in Northern Ireland for non-payment of water charges, which were going to be introduced some years back, which very quickly had a massive build-up in the months up to the actual launch of the charges. So massive, in fact, the entire plan for water charges just got scrapped. It was like a victory, straightforward victory. So I mean, there are precedents for that sort of campaign. Whether you could build one around climate change was sufficiently big is no question. But it is one thing worth considering, and one thing maybe we just ought to raise in whatever circles we have. It's something that might be worth thinking about.
Thanks, Roderick. That's actually, yeah, that the council tax strike is really interesting. I think also potentially something that like renters unions might be very up for as well. That's something to bear in mind. Luke.
Thanks, Charlotte. I've turned my video off because my connection is not very stable. Thanks so much, Tazy and Gareth, for the talk. And it's a shame about the students, but you know, what are you going to do? I'm really enjoying, just to come back on Roderick's point about the different faces of maybe liberal denial. I'm enjoying Andreas Malm's other book at the moment, which he released this year, White Skin, Black Fuel, which is a really good exploration of that inherent relationship between liberal denialism and the ways. It's quite an electrifying read. But you know, all the sort of liberal denialism and all the ways that liberals try and defer action on climate, and the far right, you know, and far right kind of open denialism and sort of green nationalism, which is, I think, things that we need to take very seriously. You know, things like green nationalism, and the fact that the environmental movement could go a lot of different ways. You know, I think that that's probably one of my big worries as it becomes harder and harder for denial. I think, as you said, Gareth, the actual facts of climate change rarely tend to be denied, although obviously they still are sometimes. But where denial creeps in is, as you said, magical thinking about technology or very targeted thinking about population growth, I think. And these are all different ways that denial is manifesting itself. Really good book. So I would recommend White Skin, Black Fuel as well, as all the other books. Thanks for the explanation of the metabolic rift, Tazy. I mean, it's just a theoretical question here, so sorry about this for everybody wanting to talk about action. But what that made me think of, I think it's a good explanation of how capitalism works. But does it go? I mean, so that concept made me think of Malthus, really, and the idea that there's this kind of harmonious relationship between humans and nature, in this kind of pre-industrial period, and there being this kind of natural limit to population growth, being as part of this kind of cyclical human cycle, and then capitalism breaks that. Capitalism breaks that by basically making it easier to produce things and to, could it? I mean, surely the idea of a metabolic rift isn't. I know it's obviously being used in Marxist terminology, but it's almost like, where does it take us to? That's maybe the question. Is there a sort of post-capitalist, so we couldn't just go back to an era where we lived in kind of harmonious relationship with nature, right? There would have to be something next. There would have to be some kind of, I'm just interested. I'm sure that they do. I would be very interested in hearing about that, because I think it's right. I think that that's what capitalism has done. But as socialists, we're not just trying to go back to the harmonious pastoral era. We're trying to, I suppose, and how does that fit in with our relationship with technology as well? So I think just theoretical questions. In terms of direct action, I agree. I think XR really are the big, I mean, the youth climate strike as well, obviously, but I think XR are the big name here. I think they're really frustrating. I know the SWP tried to influence them. I found them really annoying from what I know. I think partly we've got to see XR as fundamentally like quite anti-socialist, like in the people who go there. I think that's part of the purpose of XR. So I would certainly say that some ways just allowing them to get on with it might be a good way to go. But I mean, that's not particularly helpful. I find it quite hard to think about that, apart from like something like Ender Galender, which I think does a really good job. I mean, why don't we just make a new Ender Galender? That's my suggestion. Yeah, so sorry if that was a bit of a ramble. I just had lots of different thoughts.
No need to apologize. Also, just quickly on, I saw, Finian, you put in the chat that you want to read Max. I don't actually know how you pronounce his surname. Is it Ale? His book. Yeah, Harry, who wrote the pamphlet, also said that he considers that like a must read, and I intend to read it soon as well. I also wanted to say, I just remembered about the Edmonton incinerator, something I hadn't realized is that apparently there was like a really strong link with local BLM organizers, and that was like a really really good example of like strong community organizing linking with climate. Anyway, Rob.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so a really good introduction from both speakers. I was really impressed with that, and then there's a lot of things in there that I really agree with, particularly like Gareth's expression of degrowth and the Green New Deal. I mean, I'm a proponent of the degrowth on the far left, as well as a proponent of Green New Deal, and I do think that they are not entirely contradictory, although there are elements that there can be. I think in terms of degrowth, we need to also talk about a resource shift from the north to the south, climate reparations, and the ability of the global north to assist the global south in decarbonisation. And I consider myself an eco-socialist. I use that term more usually than a Trotskyist or a socialist these days. And, stress things like quality of life over quantity of things as a way of expressing, that we're not all, looking at going back to a miserable existence of living in caves. But really what I wanted to say was about the question of XR, which I've been looking at for quite some time now. Because I mean, for me, I think XR is a very useful movement. It's a very important movement. It's made some great, you know, it's made leaps and bounds over the past couple of years, I think, from being this kind of hippie kind of organization, whatever, without very much in the way of politics, very anti-politics to start with. And I think over the past, say, 18 months to 2 years, it's developed, particularly in lockdown, etc., and with internal discussions. And it's moving in a much better direction. And I think it's a much more fluid and open movement than just looking at its leaders. It's got some awful leaders who say some awful shit things. But at the grassroots level, there are a lot of activists in there we can really relate to and work with. And I think wherever we should be actually working with them however we can. Over the past couple of years, I mean, XR has been profoundly influenced by Black Lives Matter. In the little towns and around the country, you know, it's the same activists involved in some of those movements. So the most recent XR rebellion in London, the one that was say a month ago, you know, one of the main targets of that was the symbols of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, and they were very open about that. They went out and targeted those things and put out press releases that really talked about imperialism and colonialism, and they even talked about capitalism, even though they don't kind of use the term, but they're edging towards more a kind of engagement with those political ideas. And so, you know, we need to be in it. And just finally on the question of direct action, and I know that people have looked at things like XR and more particularly Insulate Britain and said, oh, you know, all they do is alienate motorists, etc., by blocking roads, etc. You'll never get the public on side. And I think within the climate movement, the question of direct action now is not pinned around winning over people to in that sense. It's around, we know what the science is, we know what needs to be done, we know what needs to actually happen. We need to force the government to act regardless of public opinion, and that's I think the dynamic now. So even though they can be absolutely demonized by 95% of the population, the fact is Insulate Britain's having an effect. It's, you know, the state does need to mobilize against this small number of activists, and, you know, in their terms, they're having a tremendous effect. Whereas, you know, for years people have been trying to get this kind of stuff onto the news agenda, sit in the motorway, and that actually happens. Anyway, sorry.
I think it is really interesting when we talk about direct action, this, like, the different extents to which different groups get demonized for different things. And I have noticed that, like, Insulate Britain and the way that they've been reported on in the press, like, has been very demonizing in a way that I haven't seen since that guy stood on the train, the XR guy, I think, stood on the tube train. Yeah, I think that is interesting, and like how that links in with broader strategy is worth talking about. Tazy. I'm
gonna try to reply to the theoretical question about the metabolic rift, despite not being well read on this. Which my understanding is that the claim is not that prior to capitalism, humans never engaged in unsustainable ecological processes, but is that capitalism opens up a particular way of relating to nature that is, like, hardwired to do that. And the main historical process involved in that, which is historical and ongoing, is the separation of people from land, in processes of proletarianization, where land is also then being commodified. So there's a sort of a twofold thing where, on the one hand, you are separating people from kind of more intimate, more long-term relationships with land and food production. They are becoming workers, and the land is then becoming treated as a commodity for just, like, yeah, super exploitation. So I think that it's also quite useful framework for flipping on its head the typical thing that you hear in academia a lot, and that I was taught about when I did, like, an environmental economics module at uni, of, like, the tragedy of the commons. I think it's just it completely flips it on its head. So it's like it's the tragedy of the commodity kind of thing. I think somebody wrote about that. But and then I guess the other thing I would say about that is, yes, the metabolic grift idea isn't the idea that was we have to go back. And the piece of writing I like about this the most is the one that the Salvage Collective did, and it was the introduction to one of their journals. But it's
is it the one about Fen?
What about what?
Oh, never mind. They do one about abundance, which I really liked. I wondered if that's the one.
No, I don't think it's called The Tragedy of the Worker. And they've just turned it into a little book from Verso as well. And basically, I think they're very pleased about their name aligning with this point. But basically, the point that they make is that communism will have to be a process of like saving and restoring a relationship with the natural environment. I think they've also been having discussions about how you can kind of even read that into communist histories about, like, for instance, like the fact that like the Russian Revolution happened in the context of like the absolute ruin of the First World War. So that communism kind of has often had this element of like saving and rebuilding what is around us. And so I think that's what I think about that.
Go ahead, Luke.
Oh no, I mean, it's cool that you brought up Salvage. I think Salvage does actually do some quite good writing. I guess it's in the same kind of wheelhouse as what Andreas Malm is sort of like. They talk to each other quite a lot. Yeah, I mean, there's a really good essay in one of their other editions, which is about abundance and about a lot of the worry about environmentalism is that it's kind of about austerity and things like that. And actually, it's about finding ways to make arguments that capitalism creates scarcity of things which don't necessarily need to be scarce, and that nature in its kind of natural state is abundant and kind of flourishing. It's a really nice piece. I mean, I'm not going to go into it here, but I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was a really nice piece. That I just wanted to clarify. I think XR is interesting. I mean, I think they have got better. But my impression with people who are involved in XR is people are involved in XR, they tend to be attracted to the fact that it says it's apolitical. I think that people that I know of who've been involved in XR have been involved in XR, you know, as averse to being involved in like a left wing, something which is actually calling itself socialist. And so they tend to be quite resistant. I don't know. I don't want to necessarily get sidetracked just talking about XR, but maybe that's an unfair characterization.
One thing which that brought up for me was like that before the kind of XR explosion, Reclaim the Power was like one of the biggest groups that I knew of doing this kind of, and I think like they, from the outside at least, seemed more like inclined towards the kind of tactics that Ende Gelände in Germany use. But yeah, I think like another aspect of this, which we haven't really talked much about yet, which I'd be interested to hear anyone's thoughts on, is like the just transition side of things, and like how we get from like, I feel like the ideas about what just transition should mean and like how we do it, like, you know, that workers should be able to take control of the workplace and change what's being produced, or the retraining of workers to do different jobs if they're working in polluting industries, things like that. Like, but we're very far from that unless we're just talking about making demands of the state. And I guess the thing that I always come up against is like, how do we, like, what are the steps from where we are now to like actually organizing just transition, and how does that like fit in around the rest of like building revolution, and in terms of like super immediate stuff, like we were having a conversation today about the like small trade unions, potentially trying to get them to mobilize around the COP, and the fact that in the IWGB trade union, they have a branch for Uber drivers, or United Private Hire Drivers branch. And they've said some interesting, like that they've had some arguments online actually with climate activists about just transition and about, I don't know if you can help me out, Tazy, with remembering the actual details of that Twitter conversation, but like it seems like that there are immediate steps to do with engaging workers, not just in like North Sea oil, or not just like directly in polluting industries, but also workers who rely on like other polluting things like cars, and like how we build that into like between like the stage of total transformation and where we are today, like what are the steps in between?
So on the UPHT thing, yeah, that basically the argument that they were putting forward at the time and what that was about was that private hire drivers had just been the exemption for private hire drivers had just been scrapped for the like the charge for being in central London. So basically what they wanted to do was start charging drivers like 15 quid a day to be able to operate in central London. And the really dumb thing about it was that Uber drivers can't choose to avoid central London. They get punished by the app if they reject too many jobs. So like you can't, as an Uber driver, just decide, oh yeah, sure, I'll avoid the center. So it has no behavior impact. It's just an extremely regressive tax. And so luckily, because the climate measure was a crap one and wasn't going to work and wasn't going to have a good effect, they, you know, the argument that could be put forward is this is just a tax on the poor and it's got nothing to do with the climate, fuck you. But obviously it would have been trickier if it actually was something that had been good for the climate that did just contravene the interests of Uber drivers. But I think, yeah, like that another thing that happens a lot in that kind of industry is that companies provide incentives to their gig economy workers to buy for themselves greener vehicles. So for instance, like Ocado did that. We've got a campaign going on at Ocado at the moment. They basically started saying that like people who had green vehicles would get like preferential status for getting more jobs and stuff. So a lot of people were like paying out of pocket for new vehicles that were like low emissions. And then they fired all the workers some months later when people still have all the debts from these green vehicles. So I think that this is the kind of like nitty gritty things you get where like often like a company will be sort of like either greenwashing or they'll be offsetting costs onto workers. Yeah, it's kind of worse than if they were doing nothing really, because it's broadly completely ineffective, this stuff, but it does obviously produce a skittishness around like wanting to be like, yes, we care about the climate, because the only thing people are hearing is like, if you care about the climate, then you should spend £2,000 on getting your vehicle fitted with this thing. You know, it's crap.
I actually think that links in with like a really deep issue with like climate organizing, which hasn't quite been overcome, which is like the fact that so often liberal climate solutions like screw over poor people or screw over the working class as a whole. I mean, like, and I don't know, I don't know if like if it's correct to like compare this to like the fuel tax in France that like sparked off the Gilets jaunes, like that. There's just so many ways in which like climate organizing feels like in the kind of mainstream discourse is presented as a middle class kind of like fascination rather, you know, and something that working class people either can't afford to spend their time doing or are directly, you know, harmed by the impact of green change. And I think like we have a lot of work to do to like cut through that like that structure that's been created around that, which is a real problem and like potentially a growing rift in the class. I don't know if others have thoughts on that, but Broderick.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth being a bit cautious about this because, I mean, to get a variety of views, but I think often you can underplay the extent to which working class people are really concerned about the climate. And I mean, one of the things that I find about some of this discourse is it kind of feeds into a kind of Richard Littlejohn view of the world, in which the left are all middle class people and working class are really, you know, salt of the earth, God bless the Queen Mum types who love Margaret Thatcher, you know. And it's just garbage, basically. So, I mean, we need to be a bit careful. A lot of this is as propaganda to say that working class people, you know, really hate the climate movement because they consider bread and butter things like jobs and crime and so on, and actually it's just middle class and independent people living with their heads in the clouds who don't understand how the real world works and so on. So I think yeah, we should be cautious. Just on the issue of direct action, I must say when I heard Rob's description of the tactics of Inside Britain, I was quite disturbed because, and if you go back to one of the old principles of the Bolsheviks, we can never take power without first convincing the majority of workers to back us. You can't do it. You can't, this rejection of Putschism, it was called. There is a danger, a real problem, with a view that says, irrespective of what the majority of people think, we want to impose our views on the state or whoever. I mean, at its best, it's just not going to work. At its worst, it's a way of thinking that leads to a kind of climate authoritarianism, as in, what we need is a solution in which a small group of centralized dictatorial types impose massive climate change over everybody, forces down everyone's living standards against people's will, the barrel of a gun, because that's the sort of thing. This climate change, the emergency is so terrible and so imminent, that's the only thing that we'll actually do. And you can still see that sort of thinking start to swirl around, here and there. This idea that's the way forward. And so I think it's. I mean, the Internet Britain people actually. I mean, some of the stuff we never get is ridiculous. Like, have you internet your own home? It's just irrelevant. And the whole point is the government should step in to insert everyone's home. That's the campaigning call. It's a brilliant campaigning call, actually, and actually could be a very popular one. But because it's all being distracted by the tactics they're using, that all gets a bit lost. I mean, there was a very good point made about why didn't they try and blockade the Tory Party conference this weekend, which would have been a very good thing to do. They're actually going to be quite effective, rather than blocking motorways and having fights with the drivers, which seems to be what actually happened. They actually had fights with the drivers. I think they got attacked, but the point is that it just feels counterproductive. Yeah, I mean, direct action does have a place. I do want to take a step back and say, look, this is not to say that direct action has no role to play. I think it definitely does make sense. Even activists scaling nuclear power stations and the offices of BEP and so on makes perfect sense. I think that articles and blocking roads can make sense. It definitely makes sense if you're in one of the Native American tribes and there's a pipeline being built through your area to sabotage it. It makes sense to sabotage fracking fields in Yorkshire, coal mines in whatever Hazel Graham is, I can't recall now.
Cumbria.
Yeah, all this does make perfect sense. I think that actually needs to be done in a way that's fairly careful and which brings people along with you. That's why I like the Extinction Rebellion tactic of actually going around and talking to drivers at the thing I was at, because I think that was a very good idea. It seemed to have a positive effect.
Yeah, I think that does sound like a really good strategy or tactic. Just on the first thing you said, I agree. I agree that like there is that like what you said like about the propaganda idea of the working class. But I also think that like on the other hand, like the governments and corporations are actively creating situations where like green measures are directly against the interest of workers. And like the fuel tax is an example, the zero emissions, low emission zone, ultra low emission zone in London is another example. And like when those happen, we need to be really clear on a political line around those things so that they can't like continue developing that. Daisy's in favor of the ultra low emission zone, just not for private hire. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty clear line. you've cracked it. But yeah, I mean, we're coming towards the end of the hour and a half that we had like for tonight's session. Gareth.
Yeah, can I just come back on a few things?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I won't be long. So firstly, the metabolic rift, which Tazy explained very well, drawing on Bellamy Foster and Kohei Saito. But we should remember that it's not just with capitalism and the so-called metabolic rift that people become separated from the land. I mean, think about the Roman Empire, for example. I mean, let's not imagine a bucolic idyll before capitalism. What was the relationship of the Roman Empire to land? Well, absentee landlordism was absolutely massive. Land was something you accumulated to an extraordinary degree. I mean, the levels of inequality in ancient Rome were phenomenal, and land was what the rich accumulated. It's their possessions, their treasure, which other people are alienated from, and you you farm your land with gangs of slaves who you've captured in war and you put to work on the land, not a very organic relationship to the land there, or you plunder other countries and disperse plots of land to peasants. Land was commodified to some extent, not nearly as much as in capitalism, but to some extent as well. So treating, and with the Neolithic Revolution, this is where you see an instrumental approach to nature developing. So around about 10,000 years ago, long before the rise of capitalism, the instrumental approach to nature, to the natural world, begins to evolve in humankind, and because these are class societies that we're talking about. So that rift, that alienation was already there before capitalism. What capitalism does is it accelerates it to an absolutely extraordinary degree, and turns society from being largely agrarian to overwhelmingly urban. On Rob's point, I agree very much with the the emphasis on climate justice and reparations. We didn't have time to talk on this angle more, but absolutely agree with you on there. And I'm glad it's good to see you share my view, or our view, of how to pitch the question of Green New Deal and degrowth. I tried it, if you're interested in reading, I tried it in a piece in The Ecologist, which I'm sharing in the chat, which goes into that at some more length. Finally, on Extinction Rebellion, I mean, I can't speak much on that, but my local Extinction Rebellion group was very, very disparate, very diverse. There were other kinds of people that Luke was lamenting, but there were quite a few younger people without anti-socialist views at all. It's a mass movement, and I think as socialists we have to, we need mass movements on the question of climate and environmental crisis, and they're going to come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and we just need to get involved where we can. As to insulate Britain, I think they really badly missed a trick about 4 or 5 days ago, when they were prevented by legal edict from pretty much, or it was becoming very risky to continue blockading motorways. So they started blockading commuter roads in London, in zones that are mainly used by working class people and others just commuting and so on. Now, what irked me about this, and I'm in public, I'm a big supporter of Insulate Britain. I think it's absolutely great that they're doing what they're doing, and they've raised, and their demand is wonderfully innovative. Just pick a policy that's very important, that everyone wins from. The poor don't have to pay huge gas bills, which are about to hit them next year. The houses get insulated. There are jobs for everyone. The government should fucking do this. It's a no-brainer. So they raised a great demand, and they used imaginative techniques to highlight it. But 4 or 5 days ago, when they were pushed off the motorways, essentially, and they were getting a lot of bad press, they started occupying roads in London when they should. This was exactly when the Tory party conference was starting. They should have gone to Manchester. I would have paid their train tickets. It's just an obvious, politicize the movement, go up to Manchester, occupy roads around the conference zone. Okay, it would have pissed off some people in Manchester, because those roads aren't just used by conference delegates, but it would have pointed the arrow of protest at the heart of where the problem lies, which is the Tory government, instead of diverting attention from Tory party conference to the streets of London, where there are a lot of irate commuters. So I think that's lacking a revolutionary socialist strategy there. I think they're too prone to sort of blame the lifestyles of individual consumers, when they should be immediately trying to politicize the issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a pretty good summary of I hadn't like quite put together the timeline of what's been happening with Insulate Britain. So I hadn't quite put together that, you know, they really missed a trick there. But I think, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we should find a way of saying that without it being sounding like a massive you know, criticism, but just
Yeah, we've got to
comment.
start with solidarity, and
Yeah.
and you know, congratulations to them.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll find, yeah, I don't know if I always wonder about these things, because whether it's better to do a public critique, comradely critique, or just like find someone willing to send some emails or like get in touch with organizers and do it that way. I think it depends on what exactly you're going to say. But one thing I wanted to say about metabolic rift, and like kind of prompted by your question, Luke, about like where that idea takes us, is like, I guess there's a couple of things to note. Is like the metabolic rift is much wider in some places than others around the world, and also I am like there are so many things that are already happening to heal that rift, and like they're severely limited under capitalism. But like urban agriculture, I think is a massive topic, but is an example of one of the types of ways that that can be done. And there are a few places in America where that's being done on a kind of a bit of a class basis. Like there's kind of these like urban agriculture projects that are aimed at working class access to food and food sovereignty. And then also, I guess, Cuba, like having a really high density of urban agriculture, basically because it had to, is another like thing we can kind of draw from in terms of like looking at like what can be done about metabolic rift without like being a kind of, I don't know what the word is, like those anarcho-primitivists, and at the same time resisting like the ideas of people like Aaron Bastani and like the fully automated luxury communism people who do just want to go and mine asteroids. And I thought that table you shared, Tazy, that mentioned the spatial shift, which is that one of the responses to these issues under capitalism is just to find another area to exploit and dump waste on. And yeah, we need to be resisting that as well. We've got 2 minutes left. Does anyone want to say anything else? Or Tazy, do you want to add anything in response to what we've discussed?
Thanks.
Okay.
I mean, I guess just that I'm super curious for like how the COP26 stuff is going to pan out, like with this whole like parallel conference, like whether that will produce a like change in people's sense of like whether there is a left-wing climate movement that has a strategy. Because at the moment it feels like the left just sort of snipes from the sidelines about Extinction Rebellion, and I guess it would be cool if we had an actual answer to it. So yeah, kind of wish I could go to Glasgow, but I've left that way too late. So
yeah, I hear that. Okay, Roderick, one minute.
I just want to raise a quick point which has been bugging me for a bit. Whether or not the ruling class in the Western countries particularly couldn't try and link the whole thing to the growing cold war with China by suggesting that the reason why there's climate change is largely because it's China's fault. Which I imagine that, I mean, I've read a couple of articles that sort of veer in that direction. I can't remember the names of them now. It doesn't sound they could actually argue sufficiently plausibly to convince enough people, that actually the reason why we're doing all we can, but look, it's China's fault. And link that to the kind of Cold War thing that's running around China now. That's just a thought as to what might happen. Which would be not be good news, of course.
I mean, it is already happening. Like, really, if you look at like what Trump was sort of saying, like, so much of Trump's cabinet was fossil fuel execs and stuff, and that was the whole point of that, was like making America competitive against China. So I think that's already happening, really.
Yeah, actually trying to blame China for climate change. The idea of it. They were saying, look, we're doing our best, it's all, but China isn't. It's all China's fault. I've heard things like this that kind of manipulate statistics to show the result that China is actually now the single biggest growing polluter, I think. but is by no means a so-called problem for us. But you could easily argue that actually, it is actually China's fault really, because we're doing our best. And I can see things going that direction. It becomes part of the Cold War.
I think maybe there's grounds for optimism. I don't know. I know it's the end of the meeting now. One of the things that I take grounds for optimism on, maybe quite quickly, is that there's been this 30-year period of kind of maybe a bit of a commodities boom. It's been spurred on by like easy credit and things like that. And it now looks like there's going to be quite a lot of complications in that. And that's very fundamentally linked to the Chinese economy, I think. So there might be, I don't know, I don't really have time to make my point properly, but I've started making a point now. So partly what people will say is that, you know, for the left to move forward, you need to embrace like lower standards of living, and you need to like have less stuff, and maybe in a slightly stagist way that might already be starting to happen. And like the kind of high commodity turnover society that we've been used to for the last 30 years may be decreasing anyway, as like supply lines and things get more complicated. I don't know. Sorry, it's the end of the meeting.
No, it's all good. But yeah, thank you everyone for a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Tazy. Thank you, Gareth, in absentia. And yeah, I really enjoyed the talks and the discussion. So good to see you all, comrades.
See you all soon.
There you go.
Bye.
Bye.